Okay, so in this video I'm going to talk about external MIDI sequencing with the new sequencer that I just got, which is the Squarp Instruments Hermod. As you can tell, or as you may know if you've been looking at this, that it's mainly a sequencer geared towards Eurorack and modular equipment, but it also has a lot of MIDI sequencing abilities too. Most tutorials online focus on the modular aspect. I was a little apprehensive getting it because I didn't know how well it would do the MIDI stuff, but I have to report it does pretty well, with one pretty major flaw with the sustain pedal, and I'll go over that and some potential workarounds at the end of the video. But yeah, let's dive into it. As you can tell, I don't have any of the modular stuff connected up yet. I do have a lot of the USB and MIDI stuff connected. So this MIDI input is coming from my Korg Triton, which is going to be my controller. This MIDI output goes right back to that same Triton. It has local turned off, and I'll go over that a little later too. So basically, it controls itself through the Hermod. The MIDI through on that Triton goes to a chain of synths, which is my Juno, this Moog grandmother I have right here, and then two rack synths, an older Yamaha FM, and then older Korg synth that I've had since like 7th grade, which is good for, 80s kind of digital sounds and pianos and things. So that whole chain comes out of this MIDI output. This USB host is coming off of the Moog grandmother, and so I'm actually using that and the Triton as inputs. And this USB device goes to the computer, which lets anything that's routing through the computer come out here, or it also lets this sequence software instruments as well. So as you can tell, you could sequence 16 different channels of MIDI through the out. You can do a lot, 16 and 16 out through the host, and also 16 and 16 out to the computer. So you have a lot of stuff. Your main limiting factor, though, will be your 8 tracks. You can only have 8 tracks, and if you do voice tracks that take up more of these outputs, you will only be able to use the remaining. You can't kind of double up in that sense. I actually thought that may be the case, but it makes sense from a user interface standpoint, and we'll kind of go over that as we lay it out. If you're unfamiliar with the Hermod, you have sequences, which are 8 kind of song sections. Tracks, which have each instrument track laid out, 8 of those. Effects, so each track has effects, which is how you set up your MIDI inputs. This MIDI is always here on the input, and you can set quantize, root notes, all sorts of different options, your pitch bend, your min and your max to do splits if you're really into that thing, and they can all save in the sequence, and you can pull those up so you can have specific stuff. The way I've been working is to have one template that kind of has a bunch of stuff pre-laid out, some pre-laid out Euro tracks up here and some pre-laid out MIDI tracks specifically down here, so I can quickly get working with a combination and tweak it to where I want to go. And then steps, which is where you actually record or program the individual pieces. If you have a keyboard hooked up, by far the easiest way to use this thing is by straight recording and not programming stuff in. If you're doing drum stuff, click tracks, clocks, that stuff works really well with the step sequencer, but really I'm trying to use it as like a performance tool, so I'm almost always playing something in via the 2 controller keyboards. Cool, so let's get started. I guess I'll go ahead and lay out a MIDI channel. So this is a blank sequence right here. So under track, you just pick any single note track. Any will work. Go to MIDI. You've already got your MIDI input. You just need to go ahead and select a MIDI output, which is one of the last ones here. And then so you have the option of channel, which this is kind of the key for me, is my Korg Triton. 2 is my Juno. 3 is the Moog. And 4 is the Yamaha FM, and then this is the Korg in the rack. 5 there. It is tricky. You need to go through each of your synths and figure out how to set them to a specific channel. Some of the Korg stuff, especially with combis and things, the main programs will already be set on certain channels, so you'll have to actually reprogram your sounds a little. But the individual programs in Korg Talk kind of follow the global MIDI channel you have selected. So each synth is a little different. For example, my Juno, I have to set to channel 2 every time I turn it on. It's a click little one, hold a button, press another button, but it's just something to remember with your setup. The grandmother actually had some bugs where the local on wasn't quite working and the MIDI channel wouldn't set to a different channel from what it was inputting versus what it was outputting, and both those have been fixed with the recent firmware, so I can actually report this works really, really well to sequence that kind of stuff. Okay, so getting into recording, we can kind of show how things might work a little different if you came down here on track. Oh, I scooted over. And wanted to set the layout as a 3-voice, let's say mono, aftertouch, and velocity. You can see it takes up all 3 of those tracks. And if you select those tracks, you actually can't program other stuff in the step. You're actually programming those modulation tracks. So those can't be used for MIDI output separately, I don't believe. But yeah, it records polyphonic, so whatever you record in here, it will play back. It doesn't limit you to the grid, so you can play things out of time. It's a really great sequencer in that sense, or you can come into the MIDI effect and quantize stuff as you would prefer. So let's do a test sequence. Oh, well actually first let me demonstrate one more thing. So if I go to Effects, on the second track, I can set up another output. So this is how you might set up 2 different sounds. So I've got that sound on track 2. On track 1, I can go ahead and go to Effects and set, maybe I want the Juno, which would be on track 2. Cool. So now we have that. And so, but switching between these 2 tracks, the way that is accomplished is actually by inputting MIDI channel 1. So MIDI channel 1 controls the active track, which means whatever track you're on is what is being played. If you set it to channel 2, it will actually control track 1, channel 3, track 2, so it's kind of an off by 1 thing. And what that will let you do is if you always wanted to be able to, say, play the Moog, I've got localhost off on it, so it's always getting audio from here. Playing the Moog doesn't play itself. If I always wanted the Moog to be active and onto itself, I would set it to channel 3 is what the Moog is. So I'd set the Moog to output channel 4 to play active track 3. It's a little confusing once you have it set up, and you can actually change it on a per sequence basis, so it doesn't really matter if you want it on one song but not on another. That's one way you can set it up. I kind of like having both master keyboards being able to control anything. Yeah, so let's go ahead and set up. We've got 2 synth sounds. Let's do a Eurorack sound right here. And we're going to use this mutable instruments module to just do a simple little kick drum to be our click. So we'll go from the gate of channel 3 to the trigger input there, and then we will take the output. I'm going to go ahead and turn that down a little bit over here. Cool. So we can simply go to the step mode, turn on every single step. So there you've got kind of a built-in click. Then we can come back to track and we can go ahead and sequence our first track. We can either select like this to pick a track or hold track and select. So the flashing indicates that's the active track. You can see it moves. The bright light indicates a track that is on and playing, and you can mute it in the track mode. So if we're here, this is our active track. Let's go ahead and make a 16-bar pattern by holding Y. You can drag that out and make it longer. So it's already playing, and you can actually see a little cursor will show you where you're at. If you hold record, actually only played half that length, so let's go ahead and make it 8 bars again. I wasn't really thinking about that. So I can come over here and mess with the settings on my Juno to kind of tweak that while it's playing. So that's recording, and if I want to layer this next track in, I can select track 2. I can make it whatever length I want, but I'm going to leave it 8 for now. I'll turn that down a bit. Great, so you can see how we have a track with some Eurorack stuff built up, with these first 2 tracks being MIDI tracks. You can mute the tracks, just leave one. Great. Then you can come and you can get really crazy by adding more effects, something like a MIDI delay. You can hear the timing gets a little funky there, so you could actually quantize stuff to say it's got to be on every 16th note. So track, bring the kick drum back. So that's great. You can see how we already have that open. So if you look at our track list, we have 3 tracks taken up by a single Eurorack voice. We have this track 4 free and this track 7 free. This is doing our kick drum on 3. These first 2 are MIDI tracks. So you can see how you can really mix and match between the 2 pretty seamlessly. One other cool trick that I like, especially having the Moog synth over here, is that I can use LFOs from this to adjust the Moog. So as an example, I would go ahead and hook that up on a modulation track here out of track 4, out of the CV, to the filter input on my Moog. The reason for this is I'm actually using the LFO that's already on there to kind of thicken up the sound as a second or a third oscillator. I'll turn some of that off. So we'll come to the track layout. We'll go to track 4. Say it's a 1-voice modulation track. And then you come over to effects. And you can put an LFO effect on it. Sine wave, you can set the rate, really slow it down. So this is one interesting part. I went to play the Moog, nothing was coming through. I'm currently on this LFO track. So to hear this, we'll have to come to our other empty track, which is here on track 8. And like I said, I normally have some template stuff set up around this. I'm kind of showing everything from scratch. At this point, do a MIDI output, channel 3, which is my Moog. Play bass. Whoa. Dials. Cool. So we will dial that up, and you can actually see here this LFO light is flashing. So I'll run that to the cutoff in. So you can hear the LFO really modulating that. So again, that is on track 4. So let me go ahead and play a bass line so that we have something. So go to track 8. Which holds my LFO. And you can actually make it a tempo synced, which I think is really powerful. Actually take the range. Cool. So what you're actually hearing here is that LFO on track 4 synced time modulating track 8, which is controlling this semi-modular synth via MIDI output. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers the main parts of this. You can see how very easily I've got 3 MIDI tracks going, a modular track going here on 3, an LFO on 4 that is actually controlling some of the parameters on a MIDI track on 8. Cool, so that's pretty powerful. Let's see what else. As I said, sustain pedal is kind of my one beef with this. Let me switch my Triton to a different sound, something like piano. So say this is basically operating as the center hub of my entire studio at this point. All the MIDI stuff is coming in, all of it's going out, and then the outputs of all that go to my mixer over here. Because the local off is on all my instruments, none of them, or my controller ones, the Triton and the Grandmother, they don't play each other individually. So this thing, the Hermod, does not pass sustain pedal through by default. It only passes one track of modulation, which is cool if you're doing some synth modulation stuff, because you can change the input on that to be a specific knob. So as an example, let's go ahead and go to a different sequence. Set up our MIDI output. And you can copy paste sequences. It's not always this tedious, but once you mess with it a little bit, it's pretty quick to find your way around. So here's the sound coming, the MIDI coming from my Triton and back to it. But if I hold the sustain pedal, nothing happens. So one way to get around this sustain pedal, you can set the modulation destination, that's what I'm thinking of, to 64, which is the sustain pedal. And you can set the modulation input to the same thing, which is right here. So this is a really powerful thing if you're doing a lot of synthesis, because you can almost control any MIDI controllable parameter from any MIDI controllable knob, one per track. But if you're doing traditional piano sounds, you actually want a sustain pedal. So now you'll see this should actually work. So for playing, it works. For recording, it actually does not work so well. This is a bug that Squarp seems to know about. Maybe not a bug, it's kind of a feature to be a little bit fair to them. But yeah, so let's go ahead and just record holding the sustain pedal. If I let the sustain pedal go, you'll see what got recorded, even though I can play with it, doesn't get sequenced. For me, that's probably fine enough for now. I can know to connect my notes when I'm doing them in a sequence. One little workaround is to change your input mod back to 1. So you'll see there it sustains. Well, somewhat. Actually. But if you pause while it's sustained, it actually has no trigger off when you stop the sequencer, and it will sadly just ring and ring and ring and ring. Unless I come back here, set it to set it back to 64, and then turn it off again. So, you know, that's really not ideal. It's a workaround I can deal with for now, for playing and practicing. But it's something they will hopefully fix soon. So if you're going into this wanting only MIDI sequencing and you do a lot of traditional piano stuff and are expecting that to record sustain pedal, it currently does not do it very well, if at all. Other than that, it is a great sequencer. You saw kind of how quickly we could build a track. We can really use all the features of this, especially in a small setup. It's really versatile with the LFOs, with the triggers, being able to really be expressive as a keys player, I really like having the aftertouch and being able to route that to different stuff here on the plats and some of the modular parameters. So it's really great. Just be aware that the sustain pedal does currently have lots of issues. Anyway, if you have any tips, better workarounds for the sustain pedal, anything like that, let me know in the comments, and hope this gave you some tips for yourself and gave you a better idea of how the Hermod handles external MIDI sequencing. Thanks.